I would love to see all three of those get back together again once we put it together here. So anyway, that is stuff worth looking forward to. So I'm really excited about that. But as I say, if you are interested in volunteering, then send an email to info@signumu.org, and we will connect you with our regional moot team. All right. Sorry, audio glitch over the stream. Apologize for there, but we should be back now. Should be fine. All right. That's okay. You didn't miss any substantive discussion. I was just doing announcements. So let us jump into the text here and see how far we can get now that the revolution has officially begun. Okay, so we're we ended last time, which was a long time ago now, 3 weeks ago. We ended looking at the sort of the interesting moral dilemma that was opening out, right? The way in which both Mannie and also Prof are doing things that they don't necessarily believe in, that they're not necessarily comfortable with. Like stealing from people in order to fund the revolution, and they have justifications for it, and other people have done much worse things than this, and they'll be in a position to give money back to people once the revolution happens and stuff like that. But of course, we were remembering that Prof's first evaluative question that he asked Mannie when trying to ascertain Mannie's political philosophy was, under what circumstances is it moral for a group of people to do something that would not be considered moral for an individual to do? And Mannie did not answer that question. That question was never answered, right? It kind of was floated out there, right? And so the question was made explicit, but the text didn't answer it. So we can immediately see that, Heinlein is not kind of positing some sort of rosy, kind of simple view of revolution, right? He's very clear on the fact that this is a morally, ethically complicated situation, right? And it's clear that Mannie is uncomfortable. He tells his conscience to go to sleep, right? And he believes this is for the greater good, but it's a problem, right? It is still an interesting thing to watch, right? And see how that develops, to see how sort of the conflict between the duty to the revolution and their, sort of private views, private morality, as it were, how those things are related to each other, how they continue to relate to each other. And Carrie, I think that's a really interesting point that Mike seems to be exploring this to its fullest extent. Yes, he does. Mike, we are reminded occasionally that what was Mike seeking? Like, what is Mike's angle in all of this? What does Mike get out of the revolution? Well, two things, primarily, right? One, companionship. And two, amusement, right? It's his sense of... Remember, the whole thing began. The entire collaboration between Mannie and Mike began in the context of Mannie saying, if you want to play more jokes on people, check with me and, clear them with me first, because he wanted to profit from it. And that, of course, turned out to be true in a much, much bigger way, right? He is profiting from it. All loonies are profiting from it because Mike is working with them on their revolution. But ultimately, it's still kind of... ultimately for Mike about amusement, and we will see occasional reminders of that. But anyway, okay, just a few other passages about interesting issues connected with the progress of the revolution as it begins. Here's another kind of dilemma that arises when they're going to recruit Hazel, the red-haired kid that Mannie met at the meeting. By the way, I learned at Mythmoot, talking to folks, and I didn't know this, I haven't read enough Heinlein to know it, that Hazel Jones, right? Hazel, is that her last name? Hazel Jones? Hazel, this girl who is recruited for the revolution here, is a protagonist in some of Heinlein's other works, which came before this, so that his embedding the character of Hazel in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is something like an Easter egg, something like a prequel, right? Which is really fun. Hazelstone, right? Great, thank you. Yes, Hazelstone. I knew it had that sound in it. Yeah, so anyway, I thought that was really fun. And of course, I can only imagine how much different my experience would have been of reading this section if I had read those books first. As I'm pretty sure that's the order, Arthur, right, in which they came out, right? The stories about Hazel Stone came first, and then The Moon is a Harsh Mistress came afterwards, right? So this would have been, like the, so it would have been like the Magician's Nephew effect again. The backstory explained phenomenon, which is always really fun. Anyway, okay, that was cool to learn. I didn't know that. Okay, but they're talking about recruiting her because she is clearly a juvenile, and they don't know whether that is right to do. Mannie has a good eye for recruitment, right? He can tell a good prospect for the revolution, and he can tell she is one, but she's just a kid, right? No harm done. Dear Weil, does Sidrus propose to make, this is Prof speaking, does Sidrus propose to make this child a full comrade? Let her know that we are committed to revolution, with all the bloodshed, disorder, and possible disaster that entails. That's exactly what she is requesting. That is, Sidrus is requesting to make Hazel a full comrade. But, dear lady, while we are staking our lives, we are old enough to know it. For that, one should have an emotional grasp of death. Children seldom are able to realize that death will come to them personally. One might define adulthood as the age at which a person learns that he must die, and accept his sentence undismayed. Prof, I said, I know some mighty tall children. 7 to 2, some are in party. No bet, Copper. I'll give odds that at least half of them don't qualify, and we may find it out the hard way at the end of this, our folly. Prof, Wyo insisted, Mike, Mannie, Sidrus is certain this child is an adult, and I think so too. Man? Asked Mike. Let's find way for Prof to meet her and form own opinion. I was taken by her, especially her go-to-hell fighting, or would never have started it. Once again, we see Prof's reservations, right? And his reservation is purely unethical grounds, right? Is it ethical to recruit a child who can't really understand what she's getting into, right? By entering the revolution, you are risking your life. We are entering into something which is careening towards bloodshed, disorder, and possible disaster. Can she possibly understand to be committed to that? So his sort of little mini lecture about adulthood and having an emotional grasp of death, right? Mannie's response to it, of course, is practical. By that definition, a lot of adults are not adults. In fact, right? But many adults don't really live in that state of mind. Now, but the question is, notice that once again, the theoretical question isn't answered, right? Is it ethical to recruit children who don't really understand what's going on? Of course, they've been using children, the Baker Street Irregulars, but they're only indirectly involved. They're not as that, and that's the distinction, of course, that Prof is making. They're not full comrades. They're not part of the conspiracy. They're just playing a role that they themselves don't understand. Not something they're likely to face death over. But Hazel is going to be inducted as a full comrade. The question never gets answered, right? The question never gets answered of is it moral to do this? Sidrus insists, Wyo says that Sidrus insists that Hazel knows what she's doing, right? Hazel understands. Hazel does have that she's an adult. She does have a full grasp of the situation and is committed to it and willing to risk her life. In which case, okay, I guess it's fine. I guess we've settled that particular ethical problem. But again, I was saying that the other children aren't really fully involved, but of course they have been involved, right? They've been the one who've been distributing, the revolutionary literature and stuff, right? And they don't usually get in trouble, but it's possible they could get in trouble, right? Especially if the Dragoons start a serious crackdown. But I do think we can see. But once again, the question of would it be moral for us to do that, right, as a group, is not really answered. The question of where are the limits and where shall we draw the limits? We see Prof wanting to draw limits, right? And we kind of avoid that crisis, that limit, that limit is not drawn because, we're assured that it's not actually needed in this case, right? But once again, we're kind of asked about that. And I think that it's a really important question. To me, it's one of the most interesting things about the way that this revolution is depicted, is that it is, Heinlein, I think, does a really interesting job of, like, on the one hand, it would be easy to, in describing, an underdog's revolution like this, to make it sort of over rosy, right? Like, that this is, these people are obviously the downtrodden, right? They obviously have God on their side, and and the bad guys are finally defeated, and everyone cheers, and everything is wonderful, right? It would be easy to write a story like that. Many have written that kind of story. It would also be easy to go the other way, right? And just be really cynical and have it be like this sort of dark thing, and and you're not sure whether to cheer or not when the revolution succeeds, and but he doesn't do that either, right? But he does, instead what he does is leave a lot of these open questions. And I think that he is very interestingly, and I would say even admirably, willing to just kind of let them sit and let us as readers think about them. It's much more sort of question asking than kind of doctrine asserting in that way, and I think that's really interesting. Devora, I do agree with you that the whole kids don't know they will die thing is maybe fairly modern. Just as I'd imagine kids in previous centuries saw death much more often. Oh, well, sure. In previous centuries, no question. I mean, when, very few families did not bury one or two of their children. Most kids who grew even towards adulthood, as old as Hazel is now, would have seen a couple siblings die, and certainly other kids in the town, right? So it was certainly much more of a normal fact of life in that way. I mean, goodness, even just being closer to things like the butchering of livestock makes death more a present reality. Certainly than modern kids are used to encountering. And David, I agree. I do bet loony kids see more death than ours do. Even eliminations, right? There seems to be a kind of think of the way that Mannie talks about death, right? I mean, Luna will kill you in a heartbeat, right? I mean, like it's a constant struggle against death on Luna. People die all the time. And that seems to be normal. That seems to be, it's an accepted fact of life. And so even that seems different. And so I agree in this way, Prof himself might be a little bit out of touch, right, with loony culture. And we see this several times, right? Prof was already an older man when he was sent up to Luna. And so he is not, a sort of native of loony culture, certainly not like Mannie is. Yeah. And yes, Bruce, also sex if you're on the farm, which so that's a good point. I might as well bring up another point, which I know probably makes people uncomfortable, and that is the age of sexual activity and marriage in this story, which I have to admit I find less shocking than some other things, mostly because, Devora, exactly like you're saying, the idea that like the age of like maturity and adulthood doesn't begin until 18 in theory, really more like 25 or maybe 30 is a very modern thing, right? When it was very normal for kids to be fully functioning adults by the time they were 16. I know their brains aren't done developing, but that was life. When life was rougher, that was life. Both boys and girls were, treated as and expected to act as, fully functioning adults, by the time they were, their bodies were developed. And that's, and we can see again, like the mortality thing we were just talking about, it does seem to be another way in which loony society is more like older society than it is like 20th century Earth society. It's another one of those interesting points in Heinlein's imagination of what loony culture is like. It's a really interesting kind of combination, right? It's future, right? It's science fiction, and there are many things that are futuristic about it, but there are also ways in which it has, culturally kind of gone back to an earlier time because of those kind of confrontations with reality. Exactly, Raymond, more like a frontier lifestyle. Exactly. Tomas was thinking the same thing about it being like a frontier society. Absolutely. So yeah, it's. But of course, also I would say in part, like when we hear, when later on, Mannie's talking about the 14-year-old girl who is the subject of the judging case that he does with Stu when he meets Stu. We'll talk about that because I find that a really interesting piece of loony culture. Loony culture. So we'll come back to that for sure. But she's 14, right? And Mannie's casual remarks that, at the age of 14, she's almost certainly not a virgin anymore, and that she's, like marriageable age. We talked about that in part, but also in part, I think if that makes us uncomfortable, that's the earthworm reaction, right? Just as if we are uncomfortable by, like my own discomfort with Mannie's relationship with Mimi, that makes me uncomfortable. The combination of maternal relationship and marital relationship makes me squirm a little bit. And if the idea of this sexually active marriageable 14-year-old girl makes you squirm a little bit in a similar kind of way, it makes you uncomfortable in that way. Again, there are several ways in which I think that Heinlein is deliberately sort of emphasize this is a different world, right? This is a different culture, and their culture makes sense on their terms, right? And he invites us, but sometimes, kind of harshly, right, to leave behind our earthworm assumptions, of how things are and how things should be and what is the right way for things to be, and invites us to step outside that and imagine this different world, even though sometimes it makes me uncomfortable. But it's interesting to see the kind of world that he's building there. All right, but let's keep going. Thinking about the communications, this is the part that's describing the communications and how they run their conspiracy. I accepted cell system, since it was necessary to limit losses from spies. Even Wyo admitted that organization without compartmentalization did not work after she learned how rotten with spies old underground had been. But I did not like clogged communications of cell system. Like Terran dinosaurs of old, took too long to send message from head to tail or back. So talked with Mike. We discarded many linked channels I had suggested to Prof. We retained cells, but based security and communication on marvelous possibilities of our dinkum thinkum. And then he is skipping just a little bit there. At 7th link, George supervises Herbert, Henry, and Haley. So this is, he was going through the letters of the alphabet, right? The executive cell, the chairman is A, Adam, right, is the only A, the executive cell are the B's, and then so on down. At 7th link, George supervises Herbert, Henry, and Haley. By the time you reach that level, you need 2,187 names with H. But turn it over to Savvy Computer, who finds names or invents them. Each recruit is given a party name and an emergency phone number. This number, instead of chasing through many links, connects with Adam Selene, Mike. Security. Based on double principle. No human being can be trusted with anything, but Mike could be trusted with everything. It is fascinating to see how kind of relatively slowly and reluctantly they came to the idea, like nobody ever really had the brain flash that said, wait a second, your friend the supercomputer can be the mastermind of our entire revolution, right? That slowly emerged. When they began to have the conversation, it was, I believe, Wyo who said that Mike should be chairman, or maybe it was Mannie. They wanted to make Mannie chairman first. But anyway, like that wasn't where they started, right? And yet, now that they have begun, they are placing all of their money on that particular bet, right? On Mike's abilities and on Mike's loyalty, right? Remember how uncertain, reluctant Wyo was at first, even to believe that Mike could be trusted. It's the warden's computer. Surely it's loyal to the warden, right? No, it's not loyal to the warden, right? That's not how it works. Now they base everything. So how did they make the cell system more efficient? So that the communication doesn't have to go all the way up the line and all the way back down the line. Even though Mannie had thought of ways that would prevent those lines being broken completely, right? If somebody or a whole cell was taken out in the middle, or somebody in there betrayed their cells and everybody around them. Mannie already explained how you could get around that problem, but it's still inefficient, right? It still takes forever for communications to go. So every single person in the conspiracy just goes straight through Mike, right? Mike connects. Mike is at the epicenter of absolutely everything, based on the double principle that no human being can be trusted with anything, but Mike could be trusted with everything. Mike is incorruptible. And that's a fascinating idea, right? It's fascinating because it seems completely contradictory, or it seems completely not contradictory. It seems completely unexpected, right? Mike could be reprogrammed in theory, one would think, right? One would think that, a computer that is following programming would be the most easily, altered, right? The most easily changed, the most easily, which of them is most likely to crack under inquisition, right? Under interrogation. Well, the humans can be tortured, they can be brainwashed, they can be drugged, and Mike can't. No, but Mike could be reprogrammed in theory, right? And so you know, that's and yet they're willing to take that gamble. And ultimately, the gamble is not just on Mike's loyalty. It's also on the incompetence of the other computer men, right? Or Mannie's confidence in himself, in part, right? He knows that he's a better computer man than anybody the warden has. That's why they keep calling him in to fix things when things go wrong. And they, being Mike and Mannie, are so convinced that the warden's computer men are stupid, and would never twig to any of this or figure out that Mike was behind any of this, that they're just willing to assume that nobody's going to be thinking this way. And I think that's a really interesting element of this, you know, the way that they have changed. And part of it seems entirely fitting, right? Not that they're trusting him, but that they're risking this, that they're gambling on this. Because at the end of the day, it's a gamble, right? They're betting on Mike. They're betting that will work, that will hold out. And certainly on the day-to-day, it's definitely... it's going to pay off, and it seems like a good bet, but it's still a bet. And you're right, Michelle, Mike could get bored with it, and go on to something else. Remember why he's doing the revolution in the first place, right? He's doing the revolution in the first place because he's doing the revolution in the first place because it's the only game in town, right? That's why he's doing it. And that's amusement, right? Loyalty and amusement. And that does seem risky. As Stephen Keane was asking, how much should you trust a computer with a sense of humor? He's unreliable. Mannie was saying from the very beginning, for exactly that reason, right? But they bet on him, and yeah, David, as we see, loonies are inveterate gamblers, and we can see their willingness to take this risk. It seems to be part of this, like they have to take risks. There's no other way. It's not going to be possible in any other way. Mike was first brought in to calculate the odds, right? And the odds against them would be incredible without Mike, as we see pretty quickly. More on this. Mike could never need to suicide, could not be drugged, did not feel pain. He carried everything concerning us in a separate memory bank under a locked signal programmed only to our three voices. And since flesh is weak, we added a signal under which any of us could lock out other two in emergency. In my opinion, as best computer man in Luna, Mike could not remove this lock once it was set up. Best of all, nobody would ask Master Computer for this file because nobody knew it existed and did not suspect Mike as Mike existed. How secure can you be? Only risk was that this awakened machine was whimsical. Mike was always showing unforeseen potentials. Conceivable he could figure a way to get around Block if he wanted to. But would never want to. He was loyal to me, first and oldest friend. He liked Prof. I think he loved Wyo. No, sex meant nothing, but Wyo is lovable, and they hit it off from start. I trusted Mike. In this life you have to bet. On that bet, I would give any odds. We see Mannie's confidence in Mike. He knows it's a gamble, right? He knows it's a bet, but he's gonna take that bet, right? Against anything. Yeah. Stephen, we're gonna come back to that. We're gonna come back to their gambling on the stupidity of the others, right? We'll come to a concrete example of that and talk about that a little bit more. Exactly, Stephen Cover, I agree. that is the whole hinge of the entire thing, right? In order for anybody else to reprogram Mike, they would have to first recognize that he's a person, right? Because that's the only way he'd be a threat. He's not programmed to, participate in a revolution, right? To organize a revolution. They did not program him for that, right? In order to understand the kind of threat that Mike actually is to authority and to the warden, they would have to first recognize that he was alive, that he was awake, that he was operating independently. And that, ultimately, is what their bet is on there. It's not just on their being incompetent computer men. I mean, they're kind of betting on that too, but it's not only that. What they're betting on is their limited frame of mind, right? They would never recognize the threat because they would never see Mike for who he is. And so, therefore, they're safe. Then they come up with the persona a little bit more. Have you read The Scarlet Pimpernel? Maybe in public library. Yes. Shall I read it back? I love it when Mike asks things like that. Shall I read it to you? I would have, of course, been tempted to say yes. No. You're our Scarlet Pimpernel, our John Galt, our Swamp Fox, our man of mystery. You go everywhere, know everything, slip in and out of town without passport. You're always there, yet nobody catches sight of you. His lights rippled. He gave a subdued chuckle. That's fun, man. Funny once? Funny twice? Maybe funny always. Funny always. How long ago did you stop Jim Kana at Warden's? 43 minutes ago, except erratic booms. Bet his teeth ache. Give him 15 minutes more. Then I'll report job completed. So he loves this idea, right? And this is why I think they don't have to worry about Mike losing interest and thinking it might be funnier to undermine the revolution instead of moving it forward, right? And it all hinges upon Mike's personhood, right? On Mannie's perception of Mike's personhood. Remember, just going back a slide for a second, where does Mannie begin explaining why he would take that bet against anybody? I trusted Mike, right? Mike wouldn't. He was loyal to me. Mike, would never want to. He was loyal to me, first and oldest friend. He liked Prof. I think he loved Wyo. He first acknowledges, completely acknowledges, right? Not with, it's when it really, push really comes to shove. Mannie really believes Mike is fully a person. It's not like, that he is going to act like a person is going to act. He is a full person. I was almost said a full personality, but of course, Carrie, as you were reminding me before, not just a personality. He's many personalities, right? He can manifest many personalities, whether it's Mike and Michelle, or whether it's Mike, Michelle, and Adam Selene, and he can impersonate many other people as well. But that doesn't change anything, right? That doesn't... Remember, Mannie has a brief moment of anxiety about that. That Wyo's going to give him multiple personality disorder or something. But of course, Wyo immediately assures him, no, he's got enough personality for as many as he needs. Ultimately, it's not about the personality. The personality is fake, right? The personality is put up and it changes. We see it evolve. We'll be looking for in a minute at how it evolves as Adam Selene, how the Adam Selene persona evolves. But Mannie trusts, first and foremost, his faith, right, is firmly and absolutely rooted in the fact that Mike is a person and should be treated as a person. And therefore, there's no question. He's not just going to wander off. People don't treat people like that, right? And because he has been treating Mike as a person. He trusts Mike. And here, why is this joke funny always? This joke of Adam Selene as the Scarlet Pimpernel, Mike as the man of mystery. It's funny because, of course, he doesn't have to go everywhere because he already is everywhere, right? He is everywhere. He does know everything. He can slip in and out of town without a passport, right? He is always there, and yet nobody catches sight of him. This is perfectly true. But Mike is deeply amused by the fact that this is the way that his own actual distributed and electronic nature can be sort of personified, right? It's not just that he's adopting particular personae like Mike and Michelle and Adam Selene. It's that his actual persona, his actual nature, can be kind of embodied, almost caricatured, right? I mean, it's like the idea that he is the spy master, the man of mystery, right? The one who can always see what people are doing, but is never detected by them. That he can be this sort of ultimate spy, this ultimate, the one in impenetrable disguise. It's funny, right? Funny once, funny twice, funny always, because it is in fact just a simple description of who he really is, right? It's almost like a pun in 3 dimensions, if you see what I mean, right? Mike and the Scarlet Pimpernel in this way. And then, of course, we end... oh, hey, yeah, good point. Jocelyn points out that notice Mannie used a definite article in the title of the book, right? Have you read The Scarlet Pimpernel? I don't know if it's the only time Mannie has used the word "the" in the text, but he can do it. You're right when he's quoting. Yeah, and James, very good. James Stevens points out that once again, Mike is a character from a book, and he's Mycroft Holmes. And remember that reference about Mannie not wanting to think about how Mike rationalizes the relationship between himself and Sherlock Holmes, right? Because, of course, in a sense, they're both imaginary characters, right? Neither one of them is a real person. Both of them only exist kind of in the ether, right? Both of them are personalities. Both of them are real in one sense and not real in another sense. And so, yeah, once again, he's paralleled to, and this is even more than just a parallel, right? It's not, he is, that was a joke. Mycroft, he was like Mycroft in some ways, and it was a little bit funny. But this is like, again, his actual being is like an expression of this fictional character. It's even closer than a parallel in that way. Yes, Carrie, and then of course where we're going to be going from here is Prof encouraging Mike to actually compose poetry, right? To become a literary artist and make his own fiction and such, which is really, really interesting, right? It begins to get really meta. Notice also at the end, this is the end of that sequence when Mannie is telling Mike to do all the flush the sewage, backwash the sewage up to the ceiling and in the warden's bedroom and stuff like that, and now do these sonic booms through the ductwork and everything in the warden's house. Of course, in part to make sure that he's called in to see Mike, to fix Mike because something's obviously wrong. But of course, he's also doing it to please Mike. He knows this is exactly the kind of humor that Mike enjoys. Hey, toilet's running backwards. That's funny. That's funny always, right? So we can see in the midst of this, why is Mike enjoying doing this? Not because it is clever policy towards the revolution, but just, they both enjoy it. Mannie and Mike both enjoy it, though for different reasons, right? Mannie because he likes to think about the warden's discomfort, and Mike rather, just because it's the kind of joke that he enjoys, right? So we can notice, and once again, this seems to be an element of Mannie's respect for Mike as a person, right? He knows what he likes. He's not just using him, right? He's not just using him to do to make the revolution happen. He is making sure that in and through the revolution, Mike gets what he wants, not just to keep him loyal, right? Not for a pragmatic reason, but because he's his friend and he likes to see him enjoying himself. Now, this is when they're beginning to build out the Adam Selene character. We all put Adam Selene together, talking it over at Raffles. How old was he? What did he look like? Married? Where did he live? What work? What interests? We decided that Adam was about 40, healthy, vigorous, well-educated, interested in all arts and sciences, and very well grounded in history. A match chess player, but little time to play. He was married in communist style, a troika in which he was senior husband, 4 children. Wife and junior husband not in politics, so far as we knew. He was ruggedly handsome, with wavy iron-gray hair, and was mixed race, second generation one side, third on other. Was wealthy by loony standards, with interests in Noviland and Kongville, as well as El City. He kept offices in Luna City, outer office with 12 people, plus private office, staffed by male deputy and female secretary. Now you'll remember they were already working on filling the literal background silence when Mike was on the phone, right? You couldn't hear the normal noises you are used to hearing, breathing and that kind of thing, right? Even though you don't notice it. By the way, I had an experience like this just like a couple years ago, actually. I don't know how many of you ever get like your iPhone to read things to you. I do quite a bit, actually. When you're as dedicated an audiophile as I, and always prefer to read with your ears than your eyes. Often when I'm sent long emails or I'm reading documents or something, I'll have my phone read it to me. And I noticed that when they upgraded, I think it was when they upgraded to the Alex voice a few years back, I noticed it sounded much more convincing, much less robotic, much less mechanical sounding. And it took me a while to notice, but I finally did notice they added fake breathing sounds. You can hear the Alex voice inhale before he begins a sentence. They added fake breathing sounds to punctuate the reading of the computer voice. And anyways, I was interested to hear about how, so Mike begins to become good at impersonating. He fills in background noises and, starts including various, like, biological references and noises and things like that to try to make his personhood more convincing, right? To fill that in. And at the same time, they begin to develop this persona of Adam Selene, this fake character that he is supposed to be embodying. And both of those processes seem parallel, right? But it's interesting how it is not a question of Mike himself developing personality exactly. It doesn't seem to be that. Like, he already has, I think, I think I agree with Wyo that he already has enough personality. It's not that he didn't have any personality and is now developing it, but what he is doing is getting better and better all the time at blending in with humans, right? Blending in among the people. Mannie comments on this. Yeah, interesting. Stephen Keen points out that Mike's public name is basically first man of the moon, Adam. Right? He is Adam. Adam makes sense as your only A name. Right? He's the first man. Right? I'm not sure what to do with Selene. I'm not sure why Selene. That might make more sense to others than it makes to me. But anyway, notice how they fill him out, right? And I can't help but think of Mike here, right? The way in which they're kind of trying to make... It's an alternate persona for Adam Selene, and Adam Selene is important for the revolution, right? This is a revolutionary figure that they're building. This is not, just about Mike himself. But it's interesting how this is also, in a sense, there is a sense in which they're like filling in a background for Mike, a sort of a human persona for Mike here. And their decisions are kind of interesting. A match chess player, but with little time to play. So good at chess, but doesn't get to indulge himself as much as he would like. Interested in all arts and sciences and very well grounded in history, right? So we're going to make some allowances for how much Mike knows, right? I thought it was very interesting, right? Of course, right. Selene, the moon goddess. I'd forgotten that name. Is Selene a Greek name? Yeah, maybe. Huh. Yeah. The moon has a bunch of names in Greek. Cynthia, for instance. But yeah, okay. Well, that makes perfect sense. Absolutely. Yeah, cool. Oh, she was the Titan. Okay, that's why I wasn't thinking of her. Okay, there we go. Right, that's why I wasn't thinking of her. Right, she's a generation before the Olympians. But so she was the Titaness who was associated with the moon. Makes sense. Well, there you go. Adam of the moon, first man of the moon. Exactly. And good, Stephen, I agree. It's not only that it's related to the moon and thus making him sort of the essential lunar figure, right? I speak for the moon, right? Adam Selene does, but also as a deity, rather fitting for Mike, right? I mean, that is, Stephen. It's interesting to me that nobody goes there, right? Nobody. It's a parallel that does seem to be invited, right? That there are ways in which, talking to Mike is like prayer, like they retreat into their bedrooms, and when no one is about and no one can hear them, they call out on Mike and he responds to them, right? I mean, there are parallels there to be made, but the text doesn't really make them. I don't see any overt parallels there, and yet it does kind of lurk there, doesn't it, Stephen? There is a parallel. He is a person. But he is also, in many ways, like his omnipresence, right? His, his ability to, hear what everybody is saying and everything else. It is a little bit divine. So this idea of this sort of divine being of the moon does seem fitting there in that way. Yes. But as I say, I don't want to lean too hard on that, because I don't think the text. I don't see the text really inviting that comparison very clearly. Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. Arthur is arguing that Adam Selene's name could even be a reference to H.G. Wells, his classic First Man in the Moon. Yeah, yeah. For First Men in the Moon, Adam Selene is almost like a paraphrase of that title, right? Yeah, interesting. Um, yeah, yeah. Right, Devore says, I think it's not there because he's their friend, and calling your friend God is strange. No, I agree. And because it's a first-person narration, Devore, and clearly Mannie doesn't think of Mike that way. We saw, in fact, the sort of the parental relationship he's always had with Mike. He thinks of Mike like his kid brother, as if anything, right? And so, no, he doesn't think about him in deific ways. And so, therefore, since it's a first-person narration, we don't get that a lot. So, yeah, that does make sense as to why we don't see that. Okay. Stephen Keen, here we come back to that point you were making before. The thing that drove Alvarez crackers was that phone numbers for Adam were reported, and every time they turned out wrong numbers, not nulls. We had run out, and Mike was using any number not in use and switching numbers anytime new subscribers were assigned ones we had been using. Alvarez tried to trace Selene Associates, using a one wrong digit assumption. This we learned because Mike was keeping an ear on Alvarez's office phone and heard order. Mike used knowledge to play a Mike-ish prank. Subordinate who made... I love the concept of a Mike-ish prank. Subordinate who made one change-digit calls invariably reached Warden's private residence. So Alvarez was called in and chewed by Warden. Couldn't scold Mike, but did warn him it would alert any smart person to fact that somebody was playing tricks with computer. Mike answered that they were not that smart. Main result of Alvarez's efforts was that each time he got a number for Adam, we located a spy, a new spy, as those we had spotted earlier were never given phone numbers. Instead, they were recruited into tail-chasing organization where they could inform on each other. But with Alvarez's help, we spotted each new spy almost at once. I think Alvarez became unhappy over spies he was able to hire. 2 disappeared in our organization. And our organization, then over 6,000, was never able to find them. Eliminated, I suppose, or died under questioning. Mike thinks this is a Mike-ish prank. This is funny every time, right? When they're trying to call and track Adam Selene, instead he connects them directly to the Warden's private residence. I mean, come on. That's hilarious, right? But Stephen Keen, this gets back to the point that you were making earlier on. How does nobody figure this out, right? And Mannie himself is concerned about that, right? It would alert any smart person to the fact that somebody was playing tricks with computer. Obviously, somebody is monkeying with the phone system, right? And Mike just answers, they're not that smart. They're not going to figure that out. And they don't seem to figure that out, right? He is right about that. But again, I think that this comes back to what I think it was Stephen Cover was talking about before. At the end of the day, in order for them to really understand, what are they going to, if they did figure it out, if they did realize that there was a problem with the phone system, what would they do? How would they fix it? What would they do to address that problem? Well, they would try to, check the phones. Anything they tried to do, Mike could circumvent, could handle, could deceive them, right? Because the one thing that they wouldn't do, the one thing that they can't wrap their minds around, is that Mike is alive and himself working against them, right? And that seems to be the ultimate safeguard. Mike answered that they were not that smart. And remember, I think that doesn't mean their intelligence was insufficient to solve this problem. I think he's basically saying they're stupid, in the previous sense of stupid versus not stupids. Not stupids, the defining element of not stupid is that they are willing to acknowledge the possibility, right? Mannie was the only not stupid in the world, as far as Mike knew at the beginning of the story, right? And Wyo and Prof prove themselves to be not stupids by accepting Mike as a person. And Prof does it very quickly, right? Prof is very quick to accept him. Yeah. Exactly, David. I think one of the things they might do is call in Mannie to try to fix it, or at least try to find out where it was. Now they might not, because if they did come to this conclusion, they would conclude that it was being maliciously tampered with, and they might not want Mannie to be trying to. They wouldn't want through Mannie word of that to possibly be leaking out. Yeah. And Devora, I agree. I do love the idea of the spies reporting on each other. That is really fun to imagine. Yeah. And James points out very rightly that at the beginning, even Mannie was surprised that Mike had access to all the phones. And remember, even Mike himself wasn't sure what he could or could not do with the phones, right? So that's another way in which they're not smart enough. They're not smart enough to realize that he's doing this himself, and probably not smart enough to realize that he has the capability to do what he has learned to do, and learned to do because Mannie asked him to do it, right? Yeah. Oh, Wendy, sorry, I missed your comment before, but I think you may be right. Wendy is wondering if Heinlein is poking fun of religion through his depiction of Mike, and that kind of unspoken parallel that I was suggesting before. And it is possible. I certainly think Heinlein does poke fun of religion at various points. But again, even for that, it's very gentle. It's extremely gentle if he's doing that. He doesn't even draw sufficient attention to it to really kind of make a joke of it. Exactly. But I still think it's a good observation. When Mike started writing poetry, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He wanted to publish it. Shows how thoroughly humanity had corrupted this innocent machine that he should wish to see his name in print. I said, Mike, for bog's sake, blown all circuits? Or planning to give us away? Before he could sulk, Prof said, Hold on, Manuel. I see possibilities. Mike, would it suit you to take a pen name? That's how Simon Jester was born. Mike picked it apparently by tossing random numbers, but he used another name for serious verse, his party name, Adam Selene. Simon's verse was doggerel, bawdy, subversive, ranging from poking fun at Vips to savage attacks on Warden, System, Peace Dragoons, Finks. You found it on walls of public WCs, or on scraps of paper left in tube capsules, or in tap rooms. Wherever they were signed Simon Jester, and with a matchstick drawing of a little horned devil with a big grin and forked tail. Sometimes he was stabbing a fat man with a pitchfork. Sometimes just his face would appear, big grin and horns, until shortly even horns and grin meant Simon was here. Man of mystery. Again, notice how Mike is here taking Mannie's suggestion, his Scarlet Pimpernel suggestion, and expanding it, right? But one of the most interesting things about this passage to me was Mannie's resistance, right? Mannie seems to think it is absurd for Mike to write poetry, right? Mannie doesn't know whether to laugh or cry when he hears that Mike started writing poetry. And secondly, he's, blown all circuits or planning to give us away, right? He thinks that this is a terrible idea. Now, it is not unusual that one of the things which, of course, turns out to be an extremely effective element of the revolution, the Simon Jester poetry and wall scrawlings and things like that, Mannie doesn't see the potential of right away. Mannie has a lot of blind spots. He doesn't get a lot of things. It is Prof who is able to see the strategy of these things much more clearly and much more quickly than Mannie can very often. But his characterization that Mike's innocence has been tainted by humanity, right? How thoroughly humanity had corrupted this innocent machine that he should wish to see his name in print. That desire it's all downhill for Mike from here, right? He's been he's been associating with humans. He's been trying to become more like humans, and now he's corrupted, right? And I think that's really interesting. David and Arthur Harrow are both thinking of the Kilroy was here legends. I don't know much about the Kilroy legends that you're referring to, but I think you're probably right, since both of you seem to be thinking about it at the same time here. But again, what internally here to the story, what I would come back to is the Scarlet Pimpernel thing, right? The man of mystery. Mike seems to have. It's not just vanity, right? It's not just that he has been associating with people so much and acclimating himself to humanity so much that he's picked up human foibles and vanities, as well as, being able to affect their mannerisms and their, bodily noises and things like that. But it's clear that Mike is actually thinking ahead. Prof sees it right away. This is brilliant. Both Adam Selene's serious verse and Simon Jester's doggerel, especially Simon Jester's doggerel and songs, are massively effective in the creation of the revolution, in the promotion of the revolution, and it seems what's more to be an extension of Mannie's own. Well, it wasn't exactly a joke, right? But Mannie's own amusing parallel with the Scarlet Pimpernel, which Mike declared to be funny always. And if it's funny always, it's funny this way too. He's just expanded the joke. And what's more, the kind of simpler, more, I don't know what, childish, earthy kind of humor of Simon Jester seems a little more Mike-ish as humor than the Scarlet Pimpernel parallel. Mike is taking the joke and running with it. The funny always joke of being the man of mystery. And he's running with it. And so now he's creating these new literary persona, as we were talking about, James, with your suggestion before. He not only is once again like a literary character, he now becomes himself a literary figure, creating an author persona, as well as that Simon Jester is both, right? Simon Jester is a man of mystery and also an author, right? He is a character who is created, and he is also an author. He is the voice, but he is also the puppet, right? He's and this is Mike extending the joke, and it seems almost the perfection of the Scarlet Pimpernel reference that we had before. I think that's a good theory. Mike on YouTube is saying, is matchstick drawing like a stick man or inscribed with soot from a used match? I think something like that, like something that you could draw really simply with a matchstick. Again, as you say, presumably a burned out matchstick. Something quick and simple that you could scratch as graffiti on the wall. And Devora, you're right. I think I hadn't been picturing that either. Devora says, I just realized it was just horns and grin, no eyes. I had pictured this sketch with eyes at least, and that seems a significant thing to leave out. Yeah, I agree. That's a really interesting thing. I think that I hadn't been picturing that fully either. Just horns and grin. Even horns and grin meant Simon was here. The horns to indicate mischief, the grin, right, to also indicate mischief, but also the grin is a kind of, it's a conspiracy building thing, right? The grin of Simon Jester invites you to share the joke with him, right? He's grinning at you. And so that element, right? But I agree, Devor, the lack of eyes is really interesting. It does seem a fascinating omission. And of course, in some ways, it's a self-portrait too. Mike can see very little. I mean, I think he might be able to, there might be some video feeds, but almost everything he gets is audio. Mike can tell who's in the room by listening. Mike can identify places through the phone system. Mike does very little film surveillance. He uses video feeds, both sends them to Terra and gets them back from Terra, but on Luna he's mostly listening. All grin and no eyes is in some ways a kind of self-portrait there. Yeah. Okay. But was luck that Warden... so this is when they start playing other pranks on the Warden, like the ominous messages that the Warden's going to break his leg and Alvarez is going to be there to see it. Simon Jester was posting these prophecies. But was luck that Warden, goaded too far, ran down a ramp. Even a new choom does that only once. So he walked on air and sprained an ankle, close enough to a broken leg, and Alvarez was there when it happened. Those sleep losers were mostly just that. Like rumor that Authority Catapult had been mined and would be blown up another night. 90 plus 18 men can't search 100 kilometers of catapult in hours, especially when 90 are peace dragoons not used to pea suit work and hating it. This midnight came at New Earth with sun high. They were outside far longer than is healthy, managed to cook up their own accidents while almost cooking themselves, and showed nearest thing to mutiny in regiment's history. One accident was fatal. Did he fall, or was he pushed? A sergeant. Midnight alarms made peace dragoons on passport watch much taken by yawning and more bad-tempered, which produced more clashes with loonies and still greater resentment both ways. So Simon increased pressure. Once again, we see how, one of the other ethical dilemmas, right? One of the other kind of moral quandaries. And we saw this again at the very beginning when Mannie was a little bit disturbed to find that the first thing that they had to do was make things worse for the rest of the loonies, right? To intensify the bad conditions on Luna and make the Warden and Alvarez oppress and abuse the people more and more and more, right? And the peace dragoons, who are horrible and who treat the loonies terribly and kill many of them, they're a godsend, right? Because this is the best thing that could possibly happen for the revolution. But what about the people who get killed every time there's one of these conflicts with the peace dragoons, right? But we can see the way that they are manipulating the men. Yeah, David, it's interesting. He says, at first I thought ran down a ramp should be read metaphorically. Right. It is easy to forget. It is easy to forget the gravity situation on Luna, right? You don't run down a ramp because you're gonna fly, right? And then you're gonna drop and it's gonna be awkward, and so he ends up spraining his ankle. You don't run down a ramp. You might spring up a ramp, maybe, right? Using the low gravity for your advantage, I suppose, as you're trying to go up a slope. But you can't go fast down a slope in low gravity. And it's fascinating how often how consistently we're allowed to forget about that apart, except as a theoretical fact, right? But then we get some references like this, which remind us. Yeah. But notice Also, final thing here, notice the power that Simon Jester has had. Again, although Mannie was against it from the beginning, Simon Jester is immediately powerful, right? The way that they're able to use Simon Jester and his doggerel verse and pranks to goad the warden, to goad they have the entire platoon of peace dragoons out on the surface in pea suits, searching the catapult for a bomb that isn't there, right? Just because Simon Jester said that they, threatened that it was going to be blown up, with the result of, killing one of them and creating massive unrest, and, driving this wedge between the peace dragoons and the warden. Yeah. Yeah, I agree, Stephen. It's easy to, when you picture Neil Armstrong and company, right, walking on the moon, it's easy to kind of think of the hopping gait that they use when they're walking, and kind of associate that with the clumsy big spacesuit that they're wearing, right? And so it's a little harder to imagine what walking in Luna must be like on a normal daily basis, what it is to walk down the hall. We get reminded sometimes when somebody, for instance, is thrown out the door of the hall and they careen all the way across and hit a wall on the far side, right? It's, you throw somebody horizontally like that and they go a long ways before they come down. There are several times when we see references to things like that where we get reminded of the low gravity. But most of the time it's, of course, taken for granted. As you would expect. Exactly, Biotrum on Twitch says, the lack of mention of the gravity is good world building because, of course, this is told from the Looney POV, and it's only indirectly, usually only indirectly, that we get those kinds of references. The fish aren't going to talk about the water very much, right? Adam Selene, though, his poetry is different. Adam Selene's verse was on a higher plane. Mike submitted it to Prof and accepted his literary judgment. Good, I think, without resentment. Mike's scansion and rhyming were perfect, Mike being a computer with whole English language in his memory and able to search for a fitting word in microseconds. What was weak was self-criticism. That improved rapidly under Prof's stern editorship. Adam Selene's byline appeared in dignified pages of Moonglow over a somber poem titled Home. Was dying thoughts of old transportee, his discovery as he is about to leave that Luna is his beloved home. Language was simple, rhyme scheme unforced. Only thing faintly subversive was conclusion on part of dying man that even many wardens he has endured was not too high a price. Doubt if Moonglow's editors thought twice. Was good stuff. They published. Alvarez turned editorial office inside out trying to get line back to Adam Selene. Issue had been on sale half a lunar before Alvarez noticed it or had called to his attention. We were fretted. We wanted that byline noticed. We were much pleased with the way Alvarez oscillated when he did see it. Yeah. Now, Stephen, you're right. When we get to Terra later on, we'll hear a lot more about the gravity. Exactly. Yeah, very good. The much more subtle subversion of this, of course, we can see the tendency of this poem, right? We can see what they are trying to build through Adam Selene's poem in Moonglow. That sense of home, that sense of belonging, patriotism, in short, right? This is the very first step of patriotism, a poem which acknowledges the completely unpatriotic standpoint of your average loony, right, who only thinks of the Rock, right, as a place of confinement, the place you survive, not as your beloved home, but then coming to the realization, right, that Luna is in fact exactly that. So I think that's really fun. I think that a lunar is one lunar cycle. Devora, I've never been 100% clear on exactly this. That is, the lunar cycle from the point, like basically what I'm not sure of is how exactly is the lunar cycle differing on the moon, right? Presumably it has to do with the orbiting of, the moon around the Earth, and therefore of the sort of, does the Earth change phases in exactly the same way? Not 100% sure how it would work exactly from the point of view of the moon. I presume it would be 28 days, but see, Mudmore, even the concept of day is tricky, right? Because day is a Terran concept from how long Earth takes to rotate. Day and night would not have the same meaning on Luna. So I'm not sure how it breaks down exactly. David says, I read one lunar as the time from local sunrise to local sunrise. So 29 days. I could see that. Anyway, I have to admit, the first paragraph here on this slide is one of the places I had to suspend disbelief. I am able to enter into secondary belief about Heinlein's Luna at almost every point, and about Mike. I believe in Mike. I have no problem with Mike. I love Mike as a literary invention. I don't have any problem, investing myself in the idea of Mike and of Mike's capacities. That a computer with the whole English language in his memory would thus, because he has the whole English language in his memory, be easily able to compose neat and perfect poetry, I disbelieve. I'm not really sure about that. Mike Scansion and rhyming were perfect. Like, yes, if he understood the rules of Scansion and the rules of rhyming, I think that he could form that. I'm not saying that I think that he would mechanically not be able to do it, but I disbelieve. I disbelieve in Mike's poetic abilities. But maybe that just means that I am refusing to go all the way and believe that Mike's a real person, right? Maybe it's his own, his creative spirit that I'm doubting. Maybe it's just the way that Mannie describes it, right? He basically is saying, like, because Mike was a computer, therefore, composing poetry was easy for him. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think it might be, right? It's not that I can't believe Mike could write poetry. It's that I don't believe his being a computer is what would make it easier necessarily. Devora, I can believe in his good poetry as a part of his personhood. And so Devora is suggesting perhaps the explanation of knowing the whole language is only Mannie's attempt to explain it to himself, perhaps. Of course, though, we see Mannie believes in his personhood very implicitly, but I think Mannie also is not much into poetry either. David is probing here. Okay, am I skeptical that it would be good despite being technically perfect? Yes. What makes poetry cool, right? The art and the challenge of poetry is the combination of the two, right? not just the formula. Yes, I could believe that a computer could be taught the rules of scansion and rhyming and therefore could generate lines that scanned and rhymed perfectly. But the interplay of meaning between form and content, between one sense and another, and the way that the structure itself, puts them against each other. Again, it's one thing to know the rules, and it's another thing. That's a really high level. I mean, if you can, and I don't just mean a really high level of like personhood. I mean a really high level of understanding of communication. Remember that Mannie himself was saying that Mike used to communicate like a child, right? Like like an obnoxious child with a big vocabulary. This is extremely advanced, and extremely advanced in a dimension that Mannie does not seem to be giving it credit for. Basically, that's my problem. That's my problem. Stephen King wants to know: is writing a poem harder than writing a joke? Yes. But Stephen, that's actually a really good illustration, right? The writing of a joke, what makes a joke funny, almost always, is the interplay of different meanings, right? Or at least the interplay between the expected and the actual, right? The disappointment of expectation, right? Like the knock knock joke builds on there is the expected response. And the expected response is altered, and it's that alteration from the expected response that makes it funny, usually once, right? A lot of humor is like that. A lot of jokes work like that. But there's some kind of interplay between different meanings involved in almost all humor in that way. So Stephen, I do think. But like making a pun is like the simplest version of the kind of interplay of, multiple meanings and abstract meanings. It's just a leap for me to believe. That's all. Because we haven't seen Mike building up to that in exactly that way. But I don't want to undersell Mike. Maybe he can do it. But I think that if Mike has progressed to that, then, Devora, I would come back to your point that perhaps my problem is not with Mike's being able to do this. My problem is inspired by the fact that Mannie himself doesn't seem to really understand it, doesn't really seem to get it. Carrie, Vogon poetry is always inspiring. I mean, including of, spontaneous self-slaughter by one's own internal organs, apparently. But yes, always inspiring, for sure. Okay, let's keep going. Hey, we get to at least start. I don't know if we'll finish it, but we get to at least start the legal discussion. This is, of course, going to lead back to the revolution eventually. But I find this incident really interesting because it's been a while since we've gotten something like this. And that is an incident where we are just kind of brought back into conflict with, anyway, a confrontation of, an experience of loony culture. Right, and some reminders about what things are like in Luna. And I really like this incident for this reason. Like, we get this kind of world-building moment, which is really interesting because the narrative has, after the hotel room, right? After the hotel room in which Wyo and Mannie and Prof got together and decided to start the revolution. Since then, there have been individual scenes, right, back at the Davis household and with Mike in his computer room. But a lot of the narrative has been, from 10,000 feet, right? As we've been surveying, and he's been telling us things that have been happening as the months have gone by and everything. So it's been a while since we've been sort of confronted with the differences between Loony society and Earthworm society. And of course, the travails of Stu LeJoie are a reminder of this. So let's look and see, what is it that we learn here, right? What is it that this incident is sort of confronting us with about loony society? And then my follow-up question is, why? Why now? Why do we take this time? We didn't need this whole scene, right? I mean, yes, it's important for Mannie to meet Stu Lejoie, as it turns out. But could have happened a lot more efficiently. I mean, heck, in the form of the narrative he'd been having, it could have been as simple as him saying, that's how I met Stu Lejoie one day, right? He could have jumped straight to bringing Stu home to dinner, right? The rest of this stuff isn't absolutely necessary for the revolutionary narrative, right? But it does accomplish some world building things. So let's see what those are and how they're relevant. A boy of 14 spoke up. Say, aren't you Gospodino Kelly? Right. Why don't you judge it? So they're looking for a judge, right? They come in saying, we need a judge for this case. Oldest looked relieved. Will you, Господин? I hesitated. Sure, I've gone judge at times. Who hasn't? But don't hanker for responsibility. However, it troubled me to hear young people talk about eliminating a tourist. Bound to cause talk. Decided to do it. So I said to tourist, will you accept me as your judge? He looked surprised. I have choice in the matter? I said patiently, of course, can't expect me to listen if you aren't willing to accept my judging, but not urging you. Your life, not mine. He looked very surprised, but not afraid. His eyes lit up. My life, did you say? Apparently. You heard lads say they intend to eliminate you. You may prefer to wait for Judge Brody. He didn't hesitate, smiled and said, I accept you as my judge, sir. I'm not going to try to do a French accent for Stu, by the way. I don't want to insult the French in that way. But the way of me attempting to do a French accent. Okay, so what do we see here? Tell me what we learn about loony society here. Sure, I've gone judge at times. Who hasn't? I love that phrase, gone judge, right? I've been trying to think about how to integrate that phrase into daily conversation. Are you going judge over there? But see, when you say it that way, it sounds like going rogue, right? Like if somebody's going judge, it makes it sound like they're, judging things, but that's not clearly what it means to Mannie at all. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting, David. I didn't notice that, or I wasn't thinking about it. David said he noticed that Stu dropped an article, but only one. He must be trying to keep the loony lingo. Maybe. I have choice in the matter? That sounds like it's possible, of course, just to suggest that English itself isn't his first language. But it is interesting. Maybe he is, in fact, attempting to echo, but he's not good at it yet, right? He's not a native loony speaker, for sure. Okay, so yes, the legal system is certainly very informal. And it's clear that anybody can serve as judge at any time. What's required? What's required in order for somebody to be a judge? We do clearly learn that in this passage, right? What's required? Mudd more exactly. Consent of both parties involved. The kids, the prosecutors, right? The accusers ask him, right? So they've brought it up. Why don't you judge it? Will you, Господин? They've consented, right? So all that's left is to get the tourists' consent. I have choice in the matter. He assumes that if he's going to be hauled in front of a magistrate, I mean, normally you don't ask for your consent there, right? When you're being hauled physically in front of a judge, on Terra, that's usually involuntary, right? So he's surprised that he has a choice. I said patiently, "Of course. Can't expect me to listen if you aren't willing to accept my judging." It has to be voluntary. So if both parties are willing to consent, so the authority of the judge is derived entirely from the consent of the two parties, right? Mutual agreement. Exactly, Ellen. So what else do we learn? How frequent it is. I've gone judge at times. Who hasn't? Right? Everybody's done this. This is totally normal, right? This apparently is a normal way to settle disputes. Serious disputes, presumably. I mean, presumably people don't do this, for like completely small, random, like two kids arguing over who gets to, eat the last cookie or something like that, right? But for, it seems almost any serious dispute is to be settled this way. And this is interesting in contrast to what we heard before. Remember that the references to eliminations, this passage seems to be almost corrective in a sense. Remember when we learned about eliminations before, right? Like what happens to bad actors on Luna? They get eliminated, right? You don't have to worry about people misbehaving. They don't need law. Why don't they need law? Everybody's polite in Luna, because if you're not polite, you're going to get eliminated at the nearest airlock, right? Without a second thought. So everybody's polite. People... remember when the guy was being really rude to him, asking him for his ticket when he was trying to get into that first revolutionary meeting? He was wondering what that guy's life expectancy was, right? People like this don't last long in Luna. So the implication that we could easily have drawn from that passage was, this is really the Wild West, right? People are just killing each other right and left. And it's, that there's no, without scruple, right? Without concern of for repercussion or anything like that. But we see here, no, it doesn't actually, it is not that casual lynchings are the normal way, disputes are settled. The normal ways disputes are settled is with a judge. And who's qualified to be a judge? Anybody. Anybody who is asked to be. Anybody with any common sense. Now, again, both have to agree. Both parties have to agree to the judging. But everybody has judged at one point or other. Who hasn't judged, right? Now, he doesn't enjoy it. Mannie doesn't hanker for responsibility. It's not something that he goes around seeking, unlike his friend Judge Brody, who does it professionally, right? He makes his living judging. Because, of course, you got to pay the judge. You got to make it worth his time. And also, you've got to show that you've got some skin in the game, so you're not wasting everybody's time, right? But I do not think, Sarah, that Stu really understands that he's up for the death penalty. His eyes light up and he says, "My life, did you say?" He doesn't get it. I think he doesn't understand. They've been talking about eliminating him, but I don't think he knows what that means. I don't think he fully gets what that means. My guess would be that he was thinking it meant that they were going to throw him out, right? Maybe some form of, maybe they're going to kick him out of the city. Maybe they're going to, prevent him. I don't, maybe he thinks I don't know what he thinks it is, right? But he does not seem to understand that his life is actually, in fact, at jeopardy, that they could just kill him. And Stephen Cover, you're right. He's encountering a bunch of kids. These are like teenagers. Yeah. And good, Stephen Keen, you're right. They don't only have to agree to the judge, but to the judgment. Yeah, I agree. And David Atlee, I also agree that if everybody goes judge, that implies that the crime rate is very much higher than implied by the earlier text, at least in small matters, right? But again, I think it's not only crime, but also disputes, right? These are clearly civil as well as criminal cases, to use the earthworm terminology, which would be utterly irrelevant here, of course. But all of those things are sort of involved here, right? But Stu accepts him. Okay, court has been accepted and all are bound to abide by my verdict. Let's settle fees. How high can you boys go? Please understand I'm not going to judge an elimination for dimes. So ante up or I turn him loose. Leader blinked. They went into huddle. Shortly he turned and said, we don't have much. Will you do it for five Kong dollars apiece? 6 of them. No, ought not to ask a court to judge elimination at that price. They huddled again. $50, Judge? 60, 10 each, and another 10 from you, Tish, I said to the girl. She looked surprised, indignant. Come, I said. Come, I said. Tonstaffel. She blinked and reached into pouch. She had money. Types like that always have. She reaches into her pouch as soon as he says Tonstaffel, which, of course, means, and we'll talk about this later when he explains it to Stu, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Everybody has to pay up. Everybody puts their money in. The accusers cannot get he's going to throw their case out and let him go if they can't pony up the money and they haggle over the money, right? And it's not dimes, but it's not a lot. It's not a lot of money either. Jocelyn says, what do we think disrespect to a female would be, a civil or a criminal case? Oh, criminal. Clearly. I mean, that's the case here. That's exactly what is being judged here. And it's a case for his life. Mudmore points out, and I agree with you, consent was also at the heart of the dispute in the first place, right? Consent is the issue in question in this whole trial, it turns out, right? Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting thing to remember. And all of this elaborate, not just seeking of consent, but the fact that all the loonies involved, the accusers, Tish, Mannie himself, are all operating, like nobody contests this, right? This is all perfectly normal, right? That everyone's consent not only needs to be sought, but is going to be, that the system is going to be honored. He's just said, that if they don't pay him, he's going to turn him loose. He has the power, and they would respect that, right? They were just going to lynch this guy, right? But if Mannie says to Stu right now, you're free to go, they won't pay, so you're free to go, the kids will let him go, right? They're not going to carry on lynching him, right? Everyone's going to abide by this. Everybody trusts in this system, right? The consent really goes down like to the bone here, right? Everybody takes it for granted. David is wondering why she's offended, why she looks indignant. Does she think she should get free justice as an aggrieved woman? Yes, she seems to. She seems surprised and offended by the fact that he is including her in the accusers. It's the guy. It's the boys, right? It's the guys who are accusing Stu. They're the ones who are planning to lynch him. She is the cause. She was the one who was aggrieved, right? In the incident, as we will learn. But Mannie tells her, Tonstaffel, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. If you are in this, if you are going to bring this accusation, ultimately it is about her. And he insists that she be involved, which I think is interesting. Oh, but we need a jury too. Okay, so apparently we do juries. It's not just that you hire somebody and then leave it to him, right? No, they say we should get a jury, and Mannie says something about doing it properly, right? So this is the full panoply of justice, right? To have a judge and a jury. So how do you determine the jury? Oldest lad said, this jury, you pick up chit or do we? He's wondering if they're going to have to pay the jury people. I pay it. I agreed to judge for 140 gross. Haven't you been in court before? But not going to kill my net for extra I could do without. 6 jurymen, $5 each. See who's in alley. One boy stepped out and shouted, jury work, $5 job. They rounded up 6 men and were what you would expect in Bottom Alley. Didn't worry me, as had no intention of paying mine to them. If you go judge, better in good neighborhood with chance of getting solid citizens. He's going through the motions of the jury here. He doesn't have any intention of actually paying any mind to what the jury says, he confesses. But this is the system. It's a jury of the proximate, whoever is nearby, right? I love the just stepping out and shouting into the street for jury work. But of course they get paid, right? $5 each for sitting on the jury. Why? Tonstoffel, right? There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. You can't expect anybody to do this stuff for free. If you want justice, you need to be willing to pay for it. You're asking them to do work. You're asking the judge to do work and take responsibility. You're asking the juryman to do work. So absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. We'll look at the beef and at the crime, and then we'll come back and look at the verdict and finish the scene next time. Beef was tragically ridiculous. Fine example of why tourists should not wander around without guides. Sure, guides bleed them white, but isn't that what a tourist is for? This one almost lost life from lack of guidance. Had wandered into a tap room, which let Stilyagi hang out, a sort of club room. This simple female had flirted with him. Boys had let matter be, as of course they had to, as long as she invited it. But at some point she had laughed and let him have a fist in ribs. He had taken it as casually as a loony would, but had answered in distinctly earthworm manner, slipped arm around waist and pulled her to him, apparently tried to kiss her. Now believe me, in North America this wouldn't matter. I've seen things much like it. But of course Tish was astonished, perhaps frightened. She screamed. And pack of boys set upon him and roughed him up. Then decided he had to pay for his crime, but do it correctly. Find a judge. Most likely they chickened. Chances are not one had ever dealt with an elimination, but their lady had been insulted. Had to be done. Notice again how he is kind of walking it back from this idea of the wild frontier justice of Luna. Right? Again, I'm not saying that he's contradicting what was said earlier, but he's recontextualizing it for us, right? We're not to imagine loonies, are walking around and they'd just as soon kill you as look at you, right? That's not the case. Why did they look for a judge instead of just throwing him out the nearest airlock? They chickened, because the chances are none of them had ever killed anybody before, and it's kind of a big deal, right? It's not something that even loonies do casually, we're told, especially not guys this young. So what's the problem? As Mudmore pointed out, lack of consent, right? Mannie points out, in North America, this wouldn't be an issue, right? He saw things much like this in North America when he was there, right? What has happened? She flirted with him, right? He responded. She had laughed and let him have a fist in ribs. He had taken it as casually as a loony would. So, things seemed to be going well. They were kind of on the same wavelength. Him and Tish, Stu and Tish, right? They were flirting. She was continuing to flirt with him. and the boys could do nothing about it, right? Because she was allowing it, and it is up to her, right? But when Stu then answered in a distinctly earthworm manner, right? When he then crosses the line and lays his hands on her and pulls her to him and tries to kiss her without her initiating, right? That, again, in context, one could argue, in a North American context, right? Well, if she was flirting with him, he's flirting back to her, right? This is the logical escalation, right? He's been given some kind of license to do this by her flirting with him. He seems to think, right? But in Luna, the boom comes down against this kind of thing. This is an earthworm way of thinking, that a man would take it upon himself to initiate physical contact and even kissing with a woman before he's explicitly been given permission, without her initiating it, is unthinkable to loonies, right? This violates massive taboos. And again, is really interesting because it sort of calls into question the earthworm assumptions, right? About this, the earthworm assumptions that Stu clearly had. Has she given you a license to act that way towards her? Really? Right? By her flirting with you? I don't know about that, right? And in Luna, they know exactly where those lines are. And they are very, very firmly drawn lines. Manny's going to explain that element of it a little bit later. But Mudmore, I'm really taken by your parallel there. What is most jarring about this, what makes this a violent jar with Looney, it's about consent. It's about presuming on consent. It's about crossing the line and not abiding by the rules of conduct and how you treat other people, what is okay and what is not okay. And it's a lot about consent. They consent. The boys consent to his joking and flirting with Tish because this is her right? As long as she invited it, they would never say anything about it. If she took him off to a bundling room for sex, they could say nothing about it, right? Because if she initiates it, and their consent is involved there, right? It never occurs to them to break that rule, to try to, make this unwanted newcomer who is moving in on their lady, as Manny calls her. It never occurs to them to stop that from happening because everybody consents. This is the way that things work, right? There is a sense in which one of the things that I find really charming about this whole passage, this whole courtroom scene, charming especially about the boys involved, is that it's one of the places where through most of the book until this point, I don't think I would have called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress a utopian vision of the future. It doesn't seem like a utopian vision. It doesn't exactly seem like a dystopia either, but it doesn't really seem like a utopian vision. But in this scene, it begins to almost feel like that, right? A little picture of how a good and productive society can operate. How this kind of sort of mutually consenting in these patterns of behavior, and that, these kind of boundaries of respect for other people can be established and maintained and self-policed without any force from above, right? This being a spontaneous, grassroots kind of effect, right? And I think that that's really interesting. Well, David, that's what I mean. David says, I don't think the boys did consent. They just don't have any say in the matter. Well, that's just it. They could. I mean, like physically, they could. They could speak up. They could punch Stu in the face. They could act in any. I mean, it is in their power to act in the same ways that the North American guys might act in these moments, but they don't. They choose not to. They choose not to because you're right. They don't have any choice. Like within their culture, they have no choice, except they do have a choice. They have a choice whether or not to abide by the rules of their culture. We know what they want. They don't want Stu around. Stu is competition, right? And they're all there to be with Tish, and there's this new guy, random guy, moving in on her, right? They don't want that, but they all consent to this happening because that's how it's supposed to be. Because they would never, their very relationship with Tish, their very regard for Tish, forbids them to act in the way that, territorial males of Terra might act in these circumstances. Again, this is why it begins to feel to me like a kind of, or like a sort of a species of utopia almost. Not completely. I mean, it's never like, it's not just kind of like mapping out a utopia. But we get these little utopian glimpses, which I think are pretty interesting. All right. More next time. We will resume with this. Tell you what, let's go ahead and read. So I asked you to read through the end of part 1 for next time. Go ahead and read the first chapter. We still have a bunch to talk about here in this scene, and then through the end. We're only in chapter 11 out of 13, but go ahead and read one more chapter. So read the first chapter of part 2 for next time, because we might, who knows, we might get there next time. That'll be my goal. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, yeah, David, we can continue to debate about that next time. Make sure to bring that up, and we can carry on debating at the beginning of class next time. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining me. Have a good evening. And so upcoming schedule. I am actually going to be away next week. Come to think of it, I almost forgot about that. I'm going to be traveling with my family next week briefly, but I will be back the week after. I'm traveling again, but I should be home by Wednesday, I'm hoping. So I will not be able to be here next week, but I'll be here the week after that, and then I should be here for a few weeks in a row. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everybody. And I will see you guys not next week, but the week after that. Good night, everybody.